Property prices across Australia are forecasted to continue rising in 2024. And from my analysis of the latest data, strategic investors can still position themselves for more growth. Look, I'll be honest with you. As someone who is always buying investment properties for myself and others, I've learned firsthand how important it is to take a disciplined and data-driven approach. It's easy for buyers looking for their dream home to get caught up in the emotional factors like the aesthetic appeal or a vibe of a neighborhood. But for investors like myself, letting those kinds of subjective things cloud your judgment is a surefire way to make poor decisions. Instead, I look at data and market trends to identify which areas and property types are best placed to deliver the biggest bang for my buck as an investor. That disciplined numbers-based mindset is what's allowed me to steadily build a portfolio of 7 investment properties worth over $4.8 million. And that's the same objective, data-driven approach I'm taking as I closely examine the forecast and research from the major banks, industry experts, and analyst reports for 2024. I recently did my own quarterly analysis and read through the latest data from CoreLogic and research from industry leaders like Michael Yardney. The consensus from all those authoritative sources is clear. Australian property prices are projected to keep on rising for the remainder of this year. We're talking solid nationwide growth in the 5 to 6% range for all the capital cities. The economic drivers are pretty straightforward. Population growth continuing to outpace housing supply, the likelihood of interest rate cuts giving buyers more spending power, and this FOMO frenzy setting new records. As a strategic investor, I recognize how crucial it is to carefully analyze all of this data to see what the market is going to do so I can identify which markets are heating up, which ones are cooling down, and decide what I'm going to do in the next 12 months. So that's what I'll be unpacking for you in this video today. Okay, so we know prices are projected to continue rising across Australian housing markets this year. But to really wrap our heads around what's fueling the upswing, we need to look at the economic drivers. And I'm talking about way more than just interest rates here, even though that obviously plays a huge role in affordability. According to the research, there are actually 8 key factors that will shape how the property landscape evolves over the next few years. The first one is simply supply and demand. We've got population growth continuing to outpace the construction of new housing stock. Despite a record 500,000 new migrants moving into the country last year, we're just not building enough new homes. And on top of that, cost of building and materials have gone up. Builders have gone out of business. Skills and shortages in the building industry continue to be a big problem. And homes are just taking longer to build. Extremely low vacancies and the absorption of new listings also show clear signs of this housing shortage putting upward pressure on prices. But it's not just about shortages. Consumer confidence is just as important. After hitting historic lows in 2023 due to economic headwinds, sentiment is starting to rebound in 2024 as inflation fears ease and interest rates stabilize. The wealth effect of an improving economy and rising property values is bringing buyers and sellers back into the market. Speaking of economy, how it performs overall is definitely a major driver too. And broadly speaking, it remains strong. With unemployment remaining low at 4%, healthy employment increases the overall confidence in making big ticket purchases like homes and investment properties. Then you've got factors like credit availability. APRA's current lending restrictions are tightening things up to prevent an overheated market. But the possibility of rate cuts later in 2024 or 2025 could offset that. The sentiment among property investors towards the market is key as well. Negative sentiment during 2022's downturn is now turning around as this year's price growth returns and restores confidence, especially as strategic investors make the most of the opportunities in the current cycle. And we can't forget government incentives like stamp duty concessions and the first homeowners grant directly boosting buying power and driving demand, even as policies like negative gearing changes could dampen investor activity. All these economic factors come together in different ways to shape the medium-term trajectory of the property market. With that in mind, let's dive into what the data is saying about the opportunities and risks we could see play out in the existing housing market over the coming months. The research indicates a pretty bullish outlook overall, with most analysts forecasting a solid nationwide average price growth in the 5 to 6% range for capital cities for the remainder 2024. Nothing crazy, but sustainable price growth driven by the favourable economic climate we discussed. That said, not every market is expected to go up. The standout performers are likely going to be Brisbane and Perth, with forecasted gains of around 9% thanks to strong local job markets, population booms, outpacing housing supply, and the general housing shortage situation. On the flip side, a couple of bigger cities like Sydney and Melbourne may experience slower growth later in the year, which could put downward pressure on prices. This is due to these cities being a lot more expensive and the possibility of persistent affordability constraints keeping buyers out of the market, especially if the economic uncertainty and inflation anxiety from 2023 lingers and impacts consumer confidence. But broadly, the conditions seem ripe for continued growth, with a few potential hotspots and soft spots emerging based on the supply and demand imbalances playing out in each market. Factors like rising wages, interest rate cuts, and APRA loosening lending standards could also provide additional boost to borrowing capacity and buyer spending power as the year progresses. Of course, there are always wildcards that could shift the trajectory too. The RBA's efforts to cool the economy and control inflation through higher unemployment is one potential headwind to monitor, as is the psychological factor of FOMO setting in as prices keep hitting new records. So while the overall projections indicate a steady upward climb, there are plenty of specific factors that will ultimately determine how much upside investors can capture for the rest of 2024. Based on this data, being super strategic about which areas and property types to target will be crucial. Now, while those nationwide forecasts provide a high-level view of the opportunities and risks across the housing landscape, we all know there are markets within markets. What happens in one city or suburb can be completely different to what happens in another, which is why it's crucial to also examine how projections differ across all the major capital cities and regions to identify areas that are potentially poised to outperform or underperform against the national average. In Melbourne, prices lifted just 0.23% in May, but remained 3% below their March 2022 peak, according to PropTrack data. So while more buyers are entering the market, its recovery is still lagging behind Sydney and Brisbane. Sydney's housing values rose 0.4% in May, bringing the year-to-date gains to 3% as prices hit a new peak. They're now up to 7% year-on-year and a staggering 11.89% above last November's low. While solid demand is fueling these increases, momentum has slowed from earlier 2024 levels as more listings provide buyers more choice. Brisbane remains one of the hottest capital city markets, with home prices spiking 18% above the December 2022 lows to become the second most expensive after Sydney. May saw another 0.6% increase, though that monthly pace has eased from the first quarter's blistering speed. On the ground, we're seeing fierce competition for premium properties. Perth is the nation's leader for both monthly and annual home price growth amid extremely tight stock levels. However, some of the more affordable areas appear to have overheated, potentially setting up a correction, especially if investor demand begins to cool. Adelaide is another standout, with house prices up 14% year-on-year through May, as the market defied interest rate hikes. Low stock levels have intensified competition in this relatively affordable market. In Canberra, property prices have dipped 0.2% in May, but remain 1% higher than May 2023 levels. After recovering just under a third of their decline so far, prices are still 4.5% below their March 2022 peak. Now, while analysing those market-by-market projections is very important for investors, we also have to keep our eye on the bigger economic forces that will ultimately shape how the rest of the 2024 and early 2025 housing landscape evolves. According to the research, there are several overarching trends that analysts and experts believe will significantly influence the trajectory of the Australian property market moving forward. For starters, most projections indicate the overall recovery phase will continue through 2024, though at a more moderate pace compared to the start of the year. Affordability issues are expected to increasingly weigh on many home buyers, especially at the lower end of the market. First home buyers who stretch themselves financially could struggle to keep up with mortgage repayments as rates rise or fixed rate loans reset. Some households will feel the cost of living squeeze more than others, restricting their borrowing capacity. In contrast, areas with incomes growing faster than the national average and gentrifying suburbs that attract more affluent residents are seen as better positioned for price growth. And of course, the outlook on interest rates will also be critical. While the rates have likely reached its peak for this cycle, stubbornly high inflation means we could see higher rates for longer than we had hoped. But once conditions allow potential cuts later in 2024 or early 2025, that's expected to encourage more buyer activity due to a boost in borrowing power. Other factors like sustained strong migration, the ongoing rental crisis, putting severe upward pressure on rents, and an influx of investors competing with first-home buyers are also expected to shape the housing conditions. And lastly, the economy is projected to grow, although more moderately, with low unemployment and job creation continuing to underpin markets. All right, so there you have my full breakdown of what property investors should expect to see play out across the Australian housing landscape this year. There are a lot of big picture economic forces at work, but there are also some potential pockets of opportunity if you know where to look. Of course, as an investor, knowing is only half the battle. The other crucial piece is having an effective strategy for identifying and acting on the right investment properties and markets at the right time. And that's exactly what I aim to do on this channel. My goal is to share my knowledge and tools to help you invest in property with confidence. So hit the subscribe button and I'll see you on the next video.